Noir plasma chrome bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Like what you share.
Welcome to this explainer. I want you to imagine 19th century classical mathematics as this massive, incredibly ambitious software system. It was beautifully designed, sure, but as mathematicians started pushing it to its absolute limits, it just kept crashing. See, classical math was built for smooth, predictable curves, but as the century wore on, mathematicians started discovering what they literally called monsters. These were wild functions made entirely of sharp corners or endless jumps that completely broke the machine. Limits were failing to preserve continuity, and classical integration was just completely freezing up. So today, we are going to look at the ultimate structural software patch that fixed it all, modern real analysis. And that brings us to a really fascinating fundamental question. What actually happens when classical calculus just fundamentally breaks down? Because that is exactly what was happening across the entire mathematical world. Imagine a line that shatters and jumps up or down at literally every single fraction. The old tools completely froze up. Pointwise limits were acting completely erratically, and the classical integration methods you probably learned about first, they simply couldn't handle these highly discontinuous functions. To fix these critical bugs, mathematicians realized they couldn't just write a few new equations. They actually had to completely rebuild the underlying architecture of mathematical space itself. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with metric spaces and topology, move into sequences of functions, upgrade our tools with Riemann-Stieltjes integration, dive into Lebesgue measure theory, and finally wrap it all up with synthesis and functional analysis. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive right into our architectural foundation. Section 1, metric spaces and topology. This is where we first establish the absolute basic rules of mathematical space. Before they could even think about fixing the advanced mechanics of calculus, mathematicians actually had to rigorously define the actual space it operated in, and they did this by formalizing what's called a metric space. This is basically an ordered pair consisting of a set and a very strict distance function. And this function is governed by three incredibly important axioms. First, positivity, meaning distance is always 0 or greater, and it's only exactly 0 if the 2 points are, well, the exact same point. Second, symmetry. The distance from A to B is identical to the distance from B to A. And third, the famous triangle inequality. Now, the triangle inequality is really just a fancy way of saying a direct flight is always shorter than taking a layover. These three simple rules became the absolute bedrock of all mathematical space. Now, once you define that space, you desperately need it to behave reliably. And the Heine-Borel theorem is a massive anchor for that stability. It guarantees that in standard, finite-dimensional Euclidean space, subsets that are closed and bounded are automatically what we call compact. So why is that a big deal? Well, think of it kind of like a fenced-in yard. Because the yard is closed and bounded, you know for a fact your dog can't run infinitely far away, right? Compactness essentially abstracts this idea to infinite mathematical spaces. It guarantees that continuous functions will predictably hit their maximum and minimum values without suddenly, spiraling off into infinity. But you definitely cannot take this reliable behavior for granted. The second you leave our cozy, finite Euclidean space, the rules absolutely shatter. In incomplete metric spaces, like the rational numbers, for instance, imagine a sequence desperately trying to land on the square root of 2, only to realize that number literally does not exist on its map. It just falls right through the gaps. And in infinite dimensional spaces, like sequence spaces, points can actually be perfectly closed and bounded, yet somehow remain equidistant from one another forever. What does that mean? It means infinite sequences completely lack convergent limits. It is a chaotic environment where the classical rules just fall totally apart. Which brings us to section 2, sequences of functions. Let's see how this foundation builds into a very dynamic and sometimes quite dangerous mathematical world. So here is our very first major system patch. When dealing with sequences of functions, pointwise convergence was basically the old, buggy way of operating. It allowed the convergence threshold to vary wildly across different locations in the domain. Think of pointwise convergence like a bridge where literally every individual plank has a completely different weight limit. I mean, eventually, the continuous path is going to break under pressure, completely destroying a function's continuity. So the fix? Uniform convergence. This massive upgrade enforces one single strict weight limit for the entirety of the bridge, perfectly preserving the continuous line. By upgrading to uniform convergence, mathematicians could finally safely interchange limits with integrals. Now, let's apply that powerful idea to infinite power series. When you're dealing with these endless polynomials, the Cauchy-Hadamard theorem acts as a sort of high-precision boundary detector. It actually calculates the exact radius of convergence. Inside that open interval, the series behaves beautifully. It converges absolutely, and on compact subsets, it even converges uniformly. But step even a hair outside that radius, the mathematical safety net completely vanishes. The terms fail to decay, and the entire series violently diverges. Okay, so to truly master these spaces, we need to upgrade our integration tools. Let's move right into section 3, Riemann-Stieltjes integration. Think of classical Riemann integration as measuring an area using standard, evenly spaced ruler marks, while the Riemann-Stieltjes integral completely changes the game by allowing you to swap out the ruler itself. You use a weighted function, which is known as an integrator. This whole framework acts as an incredible bridge. Step 1. If your integrator is smooth, it elegantly transforms right back into standard Riemann integration. But step 2 is where the magic really happens. If your integrator is a step function, the integral instantly reduces to a discrete sum. It beautifully, seamlessly unifies two things mathematicians previously thought were completely separate: continuous curves and discrete, jagged steps. There is, however, one very strict constraint to this elegant system. The function you are integrating and the integrator you're weighting it with, they cannot share a jump discontinuity at the exact same spot from the same side. If they both jump simultaneously, the upper and lower mathematical boundaries can never meet. The entire machinery literally jams, and it fails to converge entirely. Let's move to section 4, Lebesgue measure theory. Now this is where we find the ultimate fix to the biggest breakdown in all of classical math. See, the classic Riemann integral crashed incredibly hard on dense discontinuities. Take the Dirichlet function, for example. This is a monster function which jumps wildly at every single rational number. Riemann integration tries to chop up the domain, the x-axis, into subintervals. But because the function is jumping absolutely everywhere, those subintervals become chaotic and the integral just fails. Well, Lebesgue fixed this by flipping the entire problem on its head. Think of it like sorting coins. Riemann tried to count money as it was handed to him, one chaotic bill or coin at a time across a timeline. Lebesgue said, no, actually, scratch that. Let's group all the $5 bills together and all the $10 bills together, partitioning the range on the y-axis instead. And suddenly, the chaos was solvable. This brilliant shift allowed us to integrate over incredibly erratic sets. But to group that range together so brilliantly, Lebesgue had to invent a completely new way to measure things. Enter Lebesgue outer measure. This incredibly powerful concept assigns a rigorous notion of length or size to almost any arbitrary subset of the real number line. It works by basically finding the tightest possible mathematical wrapping paper to cover a bizarre shape, and then continuously shrinking it down until you find its exact outer boundary. But here is a really profound question. Can you wrap and measure absolutely everything? Amazingly, no. Assuming the axiom of choice, mathematicians discovered things like the Vitali set. Now, this is a mathematical structure so mind-bendingly strange that it breaks translation invariance, meaning it is literally impossible to measure. If you try to measure it, the math tells you its size is somehow both exactly 0 and greater than 0 at the exact same time. It's truly wild. By carefully isolating only the sets that actually could be measured, Lebesgue unlocked the true power of modern analysis. 3 massive limit convergence theorems. We've got the monotone convergence theorem, Fitore's lemma, and the absolute crown jewel, the dominated convergence theorem. The dominated convergence theorem, for instance, proved that as long as your chaotic, jumping functions are safely trapped under a single, well-behaved ceiling function, you can safely swap limits and integrals without the system crashing. We finally no longer had to rely on the incredibly strict rules of uniform convergence. All right, finally, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Synthesis and Functional Analysis, to see the true impact of these monumental patches. If we map out the evolutionary timeline of integration, the upgrades become incredibly clear. Classical Riemann struggled and failed on dense discontinuities because it was hopelessly stuck analyzing the domain. Then, Riemann still just stepped in, allowing us to manage discrete step function jumps through weighted integrators. And finally, Lebesgue completely conquered the densest, most chaotic discontinuities imaginable by partitioning the range and brilliantly ignoring sets of what he called measure zero. And similarly, tracing the evolution of convergence shows exactly why these upgrades were so mandatory. Pointwise convergence was simply too weak. It failed to preserve continuity and totally botched limit interchanges. Uniform convergence was the necessary structural patch to lock down that continuity. But it's in these complete spaces using Lebesgue's LP mean convergence that we get the ultimate flexibility, where the overall energy or average of the mathematical space holds our integrals safely together, even if the continuous lines themselves happen to shatter. So, what does this all mean? Well, this entire hierarchy, from the strict, grounded axioms of a metric space all the way up to the robust, flexible Lebesgue measure, builds toward complete function spaces, known as Banach and Hilbert spaces. These abstract 19th century bug fixes solved calculus, sure, but they did something much, much bigger. They created the exact mathematical framework needed for spectral theory and wave functions, leaving us with a truly fascinating thought to end on. Could it be that without these abstract, meticulous bug fixes to classical math, the entire modern framework of quantum mechanics would have been mathematically impossible to build? Just think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope you enjoyed it.
Like what you shared.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Noir plasma chrome bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.